you everybody for coming. It feels quite amazing to know that we're talking to over 100 people probably. People we can't see, but I can feel the vibes coming. So I want to introduce Jen. Jen is a friend and was a colleague for some years. We worked together in Save the Children. And I asked her to do this interview for me because we shared this amazing experience of working with people in other countries all around the world. And she's done it now much longer than I have. She's about the age of my daughters, but somehow our relationship never felt like that because we were colleagues together. And she's also has the distinction of having read more drafts of my last novel than anybody in the world could ever have possibly imagined. So she knows my writing and she knows the context of some of my writing. And so I'm delighted she can be here to share this with me. Jen, over to you.
Thank you. Thanks, Marion. And I should just say, in answer to the person who asked this, I am in Angola. I'm in Angola with my husband, who has a post here at the moment. So I'm here with the family. It's not my usual place of being. I am, of course, British by background as well. So I just wanted to talk a little bit about how I know Marion's writing. I started reading Marion's books 20 years ago now. Actually, a friend of my mum's gave me If You Can Walk, You Can Dance. My mum is also now an avid reader of Marion's books. And the book I read completely by chance, but I read when I was in Tanzania. So I was in East Africa. So it really connected with me. It connected with me in terms of the context, of course. It connected with me on the musical theme. I at least attempt in the past to be musical. And it also really connected with me in the lead character, Jenny, who's very strong and resilient, and having this split life between Africa and the UK that really resonated. So I joined Save the Children knowing about Marion, but not knowing Marion. And we met in 2002, and her engagement with me and how she worked really shaped how I have worked, actually, and how I engage with places, even to this day, including how I am in Angola. So as Marion said, I have read all of her novels. I actually can't remember how many near final. Oh no, this is the final draft of Uncertain Light, which was a pleasure to read as it evolved into the superb book that it is now. And then just obviously since it's just been released, have just read Journeys Without a Map, which is equally fascinating and equally evocative as all of Marion's novels, but it is different. It's non-fiction. It's a step into non-fiction, and it's much more personal for Marion than her other novels and other work have been. So as I'd read the other novels, I very much read it as a companion to the other novels. So I got little insights into the background, into her inspirations, and how she was writing those books that I'd enjoyed so much. But it is absolutely a standalone book as well. And although it gives you a taster into those other novels and the other writing and the other roles that she's had with other literary friends and others in her life, it is very much the world of Marion as a writer. And Marion is not, I would say, your average writer. She's very perceptive and very intelligent. She's been writing predominantly in later life, and that very much comes through the book and the novels, with drawing on an experience that is multicultural and very rich in terms of what she's done in her life and who she's met and encountered that shapes how she writes. And for better or worse, Marion as a writer has not, but actually quite unbelievably, been part of the mega business that is now publishing in the world. And I think that really, the book, The Journeys Without a Map, really sort of talked through that and how Marion grapples with that as part of her own experience as she's evolved as a writer. So Marion, you and I don't get to talk very often. I am miles away. And obviously COVID affects how much all of us get to talk, certainly in person at the moment. But it's really lovely to be able to have a conversation with you about this book this evening. So let's start off, as Julie Andrews would, at the very, very beginning, and just think, I said it's a new step for you. It's non-fiction and it's personal. Can you tell us a little bit about the genesis of the book? And how you came to write this rather than anything else at this point?
Okay, thank you so much, Jenny. It started 5 years ago when I published Uncertain Light. It was the first book I'd written since I was retired. So for the first time, I kind of realized I had a chance to be an ordinary writer, I mean, a proper writer, who goes around and gives talks about their books. I'd done a little bit of that before, but it had always been quite hard to fit into everyday life. So I decided I was going to just give it a go and try. I had a very small independent publisher who was publishing it, so it wasn't anything like big deal organized for me. But I thought, let's just give it a go. And because I was setting out on this kind of journey without knowing where I was going, this idea of journeys without a map started there in a way. And I decided to keep a blog while I was going. So about once a month, I would kind of trace through all the things that had happened to me in that month and find something that I thought might interest people and write about it. And it became a kind of a reflection, because as I was picking up events and audiences, it became clear to me that mostly what people wanted to know was, how did I come to write the books? How did I come to be a fiction writer? It's a bizarre thing to do if you think about it, making up not real people and then spending 4 years writing about them. So I was answering these questions in live audiences and beginning to realize that actually people are interested in that, as why wouldn't they be? And I'm interested in that in other people. I'm always interested in hearing where people come from and why they're doing what they are doing. And so I gradually began to relax with the fact that people were interested in that about me as well. And that came into my blogs more. And all of that was there, was part of my life. But it made me realize I was actually doing a journey back as well as forwards. I was going into the unknown with each new event and each new set of people, but I was actually trying to understand my own journey and how I'd got here. And I think that's where it would have stopped, but for lockdown. That actually, suddenly we were in a situation where all the normal things we do weren't so easy now. I'd actually just given a talk to a group of National Women's Register group in Somerset, and lovely live feeling of it, and suddenly realizing we're not going to be able to do this anymore. I thought, well, I've got all those blogs sitting there. Why don't I just pull them together, and then I can have a little written record of the kinds of things people want to hear in audiences. I thought it would be quite easy because I had that raw material. Actually, it was like a whole new journey in itself, making sense of it and discovering for myself what the route had been to where I am now. So that's what lockdown gave me. It gave me the chance to do that. And 3 months into lockdown, there it is.
Excellent. And many of us are using the probably extended lockdown, sadly, that we're all now facing to read the product of that time. Let's think a little bit more about the process of writing. We've talked about the book gives insights into how your novels have come into being, and how the experiences that you're starting to mention there have really emerged into your fiction, but also all the deep research that goes into creating those stories and the sort of richness of the text that you then produce. Tell us something about that, and particularly your own, by self-admission, mapless organic writing process.
Yes, I found some old notebooks. When I finish a book, I start a notebook by hand about thoughts towards another book, because I can't kind of conceive that I won't be working on a book. So what am I going to do next? I ask myself each time. And I just write these random notes, and then they're in a notebook, and then some idea comes, I start working on it. And quite recently, I went and looked back at all these notebooks, and my books have taken me about 6 years to do each time. So those notebooks are sort of 6 years apart. And I have discovered that I have said the same things every time, and I've paid no attention to them. Every single time I say, this took me far too long and it was too laborious to process. Next time I'm starting with a plot. I'm going to have it really all worked out beforehand, and then I won't waste so much time going here and going there and coming. And then I don't. And I clearly don't, because I can't. The plots don't occur to me. They come painfully through people. And what always occurs to me is people in places. So if I take in Journeys Without a Book, I start with the story of how Uncertain Light came to be, because it's my most recent one. In a way, I think it's my biggest book. But it also shows that sort of process that actually I joined Save the Children in 1993, more than 20 years ago. I knew from the first year, I knew that one day this extraordinary experience I was having would emerge in fiction. But but I couldn't write about it while I was there. It was all too much. It was all right in my face. Going into situations in many different countries in the world, often the poorest, often very disadvantaged people who've been affected by wars. It was all such a huge experience that it was just like full-time taking it in, trying to absorb it, trying to keep normal life going while I was doing it, and so on. So it was all kind of there. And then I visited Central Asia, and that really blew my mind. And I think the reason it did was because we knew so little about it. I say we because I knew almost nothing about it. I had to start reading like mad before I went. But I think we all knew, we in the West knew almost nothing about this big area on the map, which was called the Soviet Union. And it was only when it collapsed in 1991 and 2 that we began to realize it was actually many, many different kinds of societies, and they were all very different from each other. And going into Central Asia, I just realized my huge ignorance about it. And I was going in at a time of a civil war, which has just finished, and it was traumatic, really, for people. So this suddenly coagulated all of these thoughts from the Save the Children experience in my mind as almost like the most extreme of an exposure to another society and a very different one. But when I tried to start thinking about it as fiction, when I tried to think, how would I put this into a story, I got completely lost. It was all far too big. So all the hundreds of notes I wrote about that sit in a bottom drawer. I haven't actually had the courage to throw them away yet, but they're not the book I wrote. They were kind of like processing stuff. And then the one person who was helping me at that stage think about it was a person from whom I'd learned Urdu. My friend Ralph Russell, who was a professor of Urdu at the university in London. He's an Englishman, but he'd learned Urdu as an adult, and he got to love Urdu poetry, and he was translating it. And I'd learned the language from him. And I knew that he also knew Persian poetry, and Persian is the language of Tajikistan. So I started asking him to teach me stuff about Persian poetry. And the first bit of the story was about a poet who lived through the Soviet era and then at the end. That's the bit that got packed away at that stage. And then life went on, and then Ralph died. He was 90, so it wasn't a surprise. He'd been ill. But in that year after he died, he'd been such a close friend and mentor, and I'd learned so much from him. My children called him their adopted grandfather, actually. He was a very, very close family friend. And I'd been looking after him in his last year or so. And when I emerged from that process afterwards, I realized that actually the next novel I wrote was going to be about grief and getting beyond it. And it's such a universal experience. There's almost nobody from middle-aged onwards who hasn't had to deal with that at some point. And it became the sort of unifying thing across the huge difference culturally between me and the people that I was going to be fictionalizing in the novel. So actually the book that emerged in the end, it had the Central Asian setting, it had all of that in it, but it was a story in which somebody was coming to terms with somebody who'd gone. So, and that took another 3 years, doing all the research, as you say, trying out all the drafts on Jenny.
Absolutely. And yeah, those personal experiences, even though you don't write with you in there, you can feel that very that experience that comes through in your writing. Maybe turning to that a bit. So you even talk in this new book about your reticence to put yourself out there as a writer and an individual. But this book is very personal. You write about your experiences, your very personal experiences, very openly. So there are lovely bits in there where you talk about your amazement at ever getting on a prize list, for example, of which you have been on many. You talk about the reactions, very personal reactions that you have to people when you get feedback about characters or plots, or that they didn't like the book at all, and in some cases, and how you sort of process that as a writer. And also in your travels, you're traveling in one of the stories, you're talking about traveling as an older woman, no longer a 27-year-old backpacker in India, but but your nervousness of dealing with the city amidst all the pieces about the writing and the sort of the reason of writing those stories in the first place. Tell us a little bit about one of those stories, something that happened to you along the way that you enjoyed writing about.
Well, I'll tell you, I want to start with a quotation from another writer. Edna St. Vincent Millay was an American writer, probably 80 years ago, I can't remember exactly, maybe 100, a poet, a playwright, an early feminist, and she said, anyone who publishes a book puts themselves in the public eye with their pants down. And that is exactly what it feels like, but you've actually brought it on yourself by agreeing to publish a book. You've actually put something of yourself out there in the public eye, and if they want to throw tomatoes at it, it's up to them. You've put yourself open to it. But the second part of that quotation that I like a lot, which isn't so often quoted, she says, if it's a good book, nothing can hurt you. If it's a bad book, nothing can save you. And that's actually what you have to come to terms with, is that you don't put it out there in the public eye until you feel it's as good as you can make it. It doesn't mean everybody's going to like it, not by no means, but you've just got to accept that basically it is your book. It's the best you can do. And so if they like it, that's great. And if they don't like it, well, they'll like another book, somebody else's book. You know, that's the way it goes. So I think the process of speaking to book groups off and on over the years before had kind of weaned me into that state where I could do it. It isn't easy, but I could do it. And then I had an intensive course in it in the 2 years after Uncertain Life, because I was talking to 50 different audiences. And you obviously, they're not all going to like your book, but I had learned to trust that people don't actually come and sit and listen to a writer talking about their book unless they're reasonably open-minded, unless they're kind of looking to be interested. So you've got a really willing audience, which I hope we have tonight. And that makes you feel you can turn it into a conversation with trusted friends, really. But I think things that I've really loved about the process that have helped overcome that sort of personal nervousness of exposure, if you like, is all the little personal encounters along the way. And I'll tell you about just one of them. I didn't actually get into my book, Journeys Without a Map, just because there were so many, they couldn't all get in, but it's really stuck with me. I was in Lahore and I was speaking to the biggest audience I've ever had, which is about 700 people. I mean, literary festivals in India and Pakistan are big, big stuff. So this huge marquee, and they'd all gathered, and they hadn't gathered to hear me. I was on the platform with two much better known writers, and one of them, a really well-known writer. But we were on a panel and we were being asked questions, and when it came to my turn to answer, at one point I quoted from one of the poems it's quoted in the book, which is an Urdu poem. And it was a poem, because we were in Lahore, in Pakistan, they were all Urdu speakers in the audience, they all know so much Urdu poetry, they all knew this quotation. So I quoted it in Urdu, and this audience went kind of, here was this English woman on stage actually quoting it in Urdu, and I was like, I could do no wrong after that moment, really. So anyway, at the end of this event, I was sitting outside catching my breath, and this young woman came hurtling up to me and she said, please don't go, please don't go. I want you to sign the book, but there's such a long queue, so please wait here, I'll be back and I need you to sign it. I have to have you sign it. So I waited, and she came rushing back with the book for me to sign. She said, my fiance's in hospital having an operation, and I know he's going to love the poetry in this book, and I want you to sign it so that I can take it to him. So we had this little chat, and off she rushed. And then a month after I came back from Lahore, there was a bomb in a park in Lahore, which had never had a terrorist incident until it had been one of the cities that had been saved. And on Easter Sunday, when there were many, many families out in the park, there was this bomb. Loads of people were killed, loads of people were injured. And on Facebook, I saw this young woman who had joined me as a friend after that event. And she was visiting the kids in hospital who'd been injured. And she was putting out an appeal to all her friends to bring toys and to a collecting point where she was taking them. and she was rallying everybody she knew to give blood, to come to the hospital. And I just felt, I'm sitting here, I know some of those people who've been in that event. I can't do anything from this distance, but she's doing it. A friend of mine is doing it, somebody I met for 5 minutes.
It really, as you talk, it's very clear how personal and experienced and committed you are to writing and telling these types of stories. A range of different stories, very similar to that one in the latest book, but also telling other people's stories in the other novels and other books. And there's a theme running really quietly through the book about why you write and how your values and what motivates and drives you are absolutely at the core of why you write and what you write about. And you actually say, so I have discovered I can tell stories in a way that helps those who read them empathize with situations other than their own. Where do these values come from in your own life, and how do they manifest in your writing, do you think?
Well, yes, I'm really glad you've asked that question, because it is the key, actually. I think novel writing is a wonderful thing to do. It's a magic thing. It's like painting a picture or creating music. It's something that wasn't there before, and then it is there, and it expresses something that comes from one person and touches another person. I feel privileged that I've discovered I can do it. But I wouldn't just be doing it just to make up stories. In fact, I remember the very first time I did this, engaged in this bizarre activity. I was probably about 12 years old, and I was cycling back from school, and a friend and I were cycling together, and we decided to make up stories. So I'd tell a couple of lines, and then she'd pick up the story and tell a couple of lines. And we went on doing that for weeks as we cycled to and from school. And that was all plot. That was the kind of story that I occasionally think would be nice to be able to write again. I can't do it anymore. It was all what happened next, what happened next, what happened next, and there was no substance, there was no value in it. And for me, the point of writing a story is because we want to share something about what we experience about being alive. We want to share something about what matters. And all I can do is share how I've perceived what matters. I hope it matters to you. Different things will have matter to different people, but that's all I can do. And that's what gives me confidence when I do it, that if I've done that honestly, then there it is. And where those particular values come from, well, I do know that. And I know that, we're formed by what experiences we've had. And although two people can have similar experiences and come out of it differently, there is this real interaction between what kind of person you are and how you react to what's going on around you. And the kind of person I am comes from the kind of parents I had. I didn't realize until well into my adulthood how exceptionally lucky I was. They were thoughtful, humane, humorous, intelligent, loving. There isn't actually anything that was limiting about them as people or as parents. What was limiting about all of us was the society we lived in. I was growing up in apartheid South Africa, and that was a huge burden for my parents, and it was a huge burden for me as I grew up. None of us wanted the privileged position we'd been born into. But as I grew older and began to understand how unfair the society was that I was in, I was equipped by the lovingness of my own personal experience, by the way my parents were with everybody else, how they accepted everybody, were tolerant of everybody, were loving about everybody. And that really equipped me to go into a hostile world, if you like. And I think that ever since then, whatever society I've lived in, I have an instinctive empathy for anybody whose life is being messed around by politics, by wars, by poverty, by insecurity, by all the things that can mess people up. And I feel a kind of an immediate sense of our common humanity. And I've been lucky to live in lots of different cultures where we're all obviously very different from each other by religion or race or income, class, all of those things. But the more you face up to those things, the more you describe them, and the more you value and respect them in each other, the more you come to what's common, to what's universal in us. And I don't set out to write a novel which says that. I write stories about made-up people, but I can't help it that the people in the stories live out those values, because that's just who they are. I haven't been able to invent a character who is seriously hostile to those values. And that's probably a limitation in my novels for some people, because the world is full of people for whom those values aren't important. But I can't find, they're incidental characters in the background of my novels sometimes, but I can't foreground them because I can't get into the head of somebody like that.
So on that note, I'm a warning for everybody listening and hoping you're enjoying this. I'm going to ask one more question to Marion, and then please do add your own questions into the chat so we can bring you into the conversation. But whilst you're thinking of those very intelligent questions, I'm going to ask Marion a little bit more about this and about sort of other people and how they experience then your writing. Journeys Without a Map transports us with you, as all of your books do, to very different cultures and very different realities, different worlds. I've been lucky enough to visit or live in many of those different places, and met many types of characters of the people that you're talking about, but many other readers haven't. And what kinds of responses do you get from people, and how do you write with that in mind?
Well, I don't write with that in mind, actually. I mean, I think when people have sometimes used the word exotic about the settings of my books, for me, they're definitely not exotic. They are the normal life for the people who are living in them. And I think if I think about it at all, I write to make them normal, because they are normal. They are just a different norm experience. So that if one's living in the countryside, that's what's normal. If one's living in a town, that's what's normal. If one's living in a war-torn country, that's what's normal, sadly. So I kind of trust that that normality gets across to people, and they see, oh my God, that could be me. I could be living in that kind of place, even though I've never been in a place like that. And in fact, I saw just the other day, somebody's put up a review on Amazon of Journeys Without a Book. And what it says is that the person who's writing the review had never been in any of these places. And what the book does is open doors to them. And that it was inspiring because of the connectedness that it makes us feel with people who are in different places. So hopefully there are more people who react that way.
I am going to now look in the chat, and Natalie is going to turn on the chat function. And as we're waiting for some of those questions to come in, I was just thinking about that and reflecting on how I and other people that I know relate to that sort of exoticness and that differentness. Obviously, I know the cultures. A lot of it's very accurate in terms of the context, and even the conflict context, the sub-Saharan African, the Central Asian context. Your writing is so evocative, it takes me there, so accurate, it takes me there and transports me there. But it's so evocative that I hope that other people would also feel that they were transported there as well. The organizations, they've evolved a lot as well, but there are those characters, those skill sets, those eccentricities are all very much there as part of life. And part of picking up your book is engaging that and realizing there are these amazing people who go out and negotiate peace deals in the most dangerous situations, who are some of the most amazing people. So that for me is a real sort of selling point. But also I read these as a young, well, started reading as a young development worker, also going out as a female, relatively confident, but also on a learning journey, going into these new cultures.
working with organisations like Save the Children and Water Aid and other smaller organisations, and having those experiences of meeting women, going with women to the watering hole to get water, and having those conversations, those real life conversations. And ultimately, your books are about people and the relationships that they have and the situations that they come into and how they deal with them. And so ultimately it's about humanity. And I know that that's why my mum will also read them, and her friends will also read them, and they live in, you know, Oxfordshire, and they have not been to Afghanistan or Malawi or anywhere else that you or I may have been to. So I'm really confident that what you're saying is very really resonates with people. So now we're getting some good questions in here. So I'm going to turn to this, and on this we're talking about places. Somebody's asking, have you got a favourite place in the world?
Me. Right now, the favourite place would be a place I could get together with my grandchildren, which is not very easy to do. So it's not really about the place, it's about the people you can be with. But I've been lucky to live in really amazing places, and most of my life has been spent in Britain. I've lived here since I was 32 and I'm now 76, so that's a very big chunk of time. I'm very in love with the English countryside, which is where I choose to spend my holidays. But every one of the places that I've been is like a takeover bid when you're there. When I'm not a very good traveler. I get quite nervous before I travel and over prepare myself. But when I get to a place, I never want to leave. It's so absorbing and can be beautiful, can be gaunt, whatever. But it's the involvement of the people in those places. And the answer is no, I don't have a favorite place.
Somebody else who clearly has encountered you before has posted a lovely comment about how A Language in Common, which is your first book of short stories, showed how well you can be curious and interested in people's backstories. If you're a friend of Marion, she has quite a discerning characteristic of whenever you meet her, she asks, how are you? And then, no, really, how are you? And really wants to know about what's going on and everything that she can unpack and talk about, which is a lovely side to friendship, and very rare, frankly, these days, where people skim over things. And that plays out in how you write. And the Alison who's writing here, Alison Elliman, says that it shows that your writing shows how you can be really genuinely curious and interested in people's backstories and understand, for example, in Language in Common, that helped you to understand how they can learn and learn English and engage in society. But your interest and curiosity in people clearly comes through. And I think everything that you've just been talking about really exemplifies that. Which I assume you would agree. Is that something that you do deliberately?
Well, what I've learned in the process of going around talking to people about my books is that it's mutual. Is that people are interested in me, and as I'm interested in them, and it's a sort of a mutual thing. But I think people are sometimes shy to ask, and perhaps that's a cultural difference in me, having grown up in South Africa, which I think is a less shy society. And my friend Ralph that I was talking about was English. He'd grown up entirely in England, but he was the most unshy Englishman I've ever encountered. My daughters had to sort of, be careful if they took their boyfriends to meet him, because he would be asking them a whole lot of very personal questions immediately to get to know them. And I think few people do that quite so directly, but I think most people like to be known.
I would say that Marion possibly took the same approach with my husband when she met him for the first time. it rubs off on you. There's obviously interest as well about your writing. So let's switch track a little bit about your writing. And somebody asks, when you're actually writing a book, how disciplined are you? Are you a 9-to-5 person in your efforts?
Well, for most of my writing life, I've been working full time and had children and grandchildren, and time for writing was like so rare. So the only way I could do it was to get up very early in the morning, got up at 5, wrote until 8 when the day had to begin, and then went to work. And it was like my precious time, my meditation time. It was never any difficulty getting straight to it and concentrating. But since I've had the luxury of being able to keep writing past 8 o'clock, I don't any longer have to wake up at 5 anymore. I can wake up at a more reasonable time, but I just write until I'm exhausted, and it takes me quite a while to realize that it's time to stop. A lifetime of not ever having had enough time for it means my concentration's like just there when I start. So these days I go for a walk in the morning, and then I come and I work in the morning, and I never arrange to do anything with anybody else in the morning. That's my writing time.
I also, there's a question coming in, which is one that many people have asked about this particular book. It is an ebook. Many people say that they don't do ebooks. I have to say that I was one of those people who said that I don't do ebooks, although I have been converted with this book and others. Are you missing readers because of this? And is it going to come out in other forms, or is this the form for this book?
It is. I mean, I also love a proper book. I like to hold a book. I like to go to bed with it, and I don't like to be reading on a screen last thing at night. So I totally sympathize with the people. But I think most of the people who say they don't do ebooks say it because they've never tried, and they think it's complicated and technological and difficult. And actually, it isn't. It's just really, I mean, it's terribly simple, and you don't need a Kindle for it. You can just download it onto any, if you're watching a Zoom, you've got a computer, you can download it onto a computer or a phone or an iPad or whatever. But the reason it's an ebook is because we're in a pandemic. You know, it's just as simple as that. Publishing is in disarray, like everything else is in disarray. If I were to wait around for a publisher to decide that this is a book they think they can make money out of, you wouldn't have a chance to read it for the next 3 years. So it's just great that we've got this facility of getting it out there. And what I would say is, you know, we've all got to find new ways of living as normally as we can through the pandemic. We can't wait until it's over before we do good things that are good for us, and reading is one of them. So if you haven't tried an ebook, I'd be absolutely delighted if you do.
One of the things that's different about this book is also that it is in chunks. You mentioned it being based around blogs, and the chapters are much shorter. It's not one of those, you know, a meaty novel that you have to keep reading to see what's going to happen with the other books, and that means that it's actually very nice to dip in and out of for anyone who's got a busy job, or like me, young children who don't really give you much time to read. It's really nice to be able to read those smaller pieces, and I felt that actually reading it on an ebook format actually enabled that a bit easier, that I could really dip in and out, and I could go back very easily and bookmark and really get into it. So I hope that other people will try. I am working on my own family in the same way to take it up, who are all going to get it for Christmas. So you talked about people being interested in you, and I think these are the kinds of questions that are really starting to come through now on the chat. So let's take a little different tack and talk about that. Jill asks, apart from your books, what are you most proud about?
My children and my grandchildren. I just think I have two amazing daughters who've had, you know, everybody has difficult lives in some ways. They've had complications, but they're just wonderful young women. I feel amazed and delighted to have them in my life. And my grandchildren are all so different, but each one's such a very special person. The fact that when I say proud, I know it's not really proud, because proud implies that you've done it. I absolutely haven't done it. They are just themselves, but I'm delighted to have them in my life. I don't think there's much I'm proud of, really.
Marion also had a very long career in development and in the field of education, and has many other things that she could equally be proud of, and that many others have enjoyed working with her on, whether it's teaching English to refugees or through to travelling the world as an education advisor for Save the Children, and really bringing that personal touch to that and taking it back down to what matters in life. So I think that other people would add to that list of things you could be proud of, Marion.
Well, I have actually remembered something now that you say it. There was one thing I did in Save the Children that I'm proud of, which was that when I joined Save the Children, education was quite a newish area. I was in fact the first education advisor in Save the Children. There'd been lots of education work done, but there was nobody in the head office who was supposed to keep an overview of it. So nobody actually knew what the education work of no one person could say, this is the work the organization does in education. So my first job was to try and find that out and do it. But what I found out was that Save the Children grew up as an emergency response organization. It was formed in the wake of the First World War, and it's always been very strong on responding after there's an emergency, as an earthquake, a tsunami, a war, and helping people pick up the pieces. And that's a lot of where it gets its huge experience from. But it was never doing education in emergencies, because the idea was we're dealing with immediate life-saving things, food and water and shelter and so on, and education isn't a life-saving thing. And actually, now if you go on the Save the Children website and you see what kinds of things they're saying they do and what kinds of appeals they're making after a war, or for instance for the Syrian refugee children, they're saying we have safe places for children to play. We are doing education work with these children who would otherwise completely miss out on education because there's been a war. And that policy change in the Save the Children organization came about because my friends and colleagues and I constantly saw that children who had been affected by war missed out forever on the chance of education. They never got back in. And then education does become a life-saving thing, because without those skills to take you to somewhere where you can make more of your life, you're lost. So collectively, we gradually, and through many boring meetings and many long papers, which we had to persuade other people to read, we got a policy change, and it's there.
And I, when I'm not on secondment, work for the UK government in the development assistance world, and I would say that that has also resonated up to that level as well, in terms of what a priority is when an emergency happens and when a conflict destroys the lives of so many people of different ages, that it's now a given that those safe spaces, and that's the psychological help and the education help, is absolutely vital for children to help them normalise their situation. So it has a profound impact, so much wider than only Save the Children policy. So you're talking about international life a little bit again. Liz asks, is there a country you prefer not to visit, and why?
You know, there wouldn't be a country I would prefer not to visit, but there are governments in many countries that I would prefer not to put myself under the power of, and whose rule over their own people I deeply regret. And sadly, some of the countries that I have lived in, have spent time in, and know best, have really terribly oppressive and misguided governments right now, one of which is America and the United States. I lived there for a year when I was 18, and it was a wonderful experience. And I can never feel, you know, there's this us and they thing. I can never feel them about America. It's also me and my beloved family there. And I feel very much for people who have to put up with Trump as a president.
You talking a little bit about your younger life now. It's not a big spoiler to say that the book towards the end goes back to your beginnings.
tell us a little bit, just give us a little snapshot of what you're working on at the moment, and what you said that you have a notebook of the next project. When you finish the next one, you finish the other one, you finish Journeys Without a Map, you've got that notebook, you're working on something else that's really coming to fruition. What are you working on now that you're just profiling a little bit at the end of Journeys Without a Map?
Well, it's not a novel, which makes it easier because I don't have to invent a plot. But you do still have to work out an awful lot about how you're going to tell a story, even if it's a true story. And the story I want to tell is about my parents, and particularly my mother. And I think it's a thing that's been growing on me for years. As I said earlier, as I realized that actually I was exceptionally lucky in what they passed on to me. And I've been thinking about what made them the kind of people they were. So that goes back to their childhood and the influences on them. So it's a kind of a history of the world they grew up in, and they're growing up in it in the time before I knew them. Some of you, if any of you have connected with me on Facebook, you'll perhaps know that I've been putting up a serial story through lockdown of my mother's early life, which I'm able to do because when she was in her 80s, I got her to write her childhood memories. So I have that as I have wonderful little vignettes from her, which she wrote in a very succinct form, and I've kind of backed them up with the context of the kinds of places she was in at the time. So that's there on my Facebook page if anybody's interested in dipping into it. But it's the beginning of what will be a bigger book, and it won't necessarily have the form it does at the moment on the Facebook extracts.
We all expect it to evolve in your mapless process. So you're talking about your parents. I'm assuming this one is going to you. You're talking about your parents here. You talked about them being based in South Africa, in apartheid South Africa. But did your parents travel and do similar work?
No.
And do you have siblings who have also got the same drive that you have?
I think I had 3 older brothers. The oldest one died much too young. He was 47. He and his family had just emigrated to Australia because of the South African political situation. My other 2 brothers left South Africa similarly. One is in Britain, one is in Denmark. All of us shared the same values. We had very different personalities, very different. But it is interesting if we remember our childhood growing up time, although we were as children experiencing things very differently, we all remember those positive qualities of it the same. And the brother in Australia, his family, they're the same. You know, his 3 grown-up children, when very rarely they would travel in Europe, and we hadn't seen each other for 6 years, 7 years, and the moment they walked into the house we were family. It was quite extraordinary. So I think among all the scattered bits of the family, there are people who do extraordinary work of various kinds, but nobody else has worked for an international development agency.
So on that note of looking forward, perhaps from the basis of your own experience, your upbringing in your childhood, the final question coming from everyone listening is that you've obviously seen the best and the worst of people and societies through your life and your travels, and they're wondering, do you feel optimistic or pessimistic about the future?
Well, it's a 2-part answer, because as you know, if one was seriously analysing what's going on, there is no way to be optimistic about what's happening to the earth in terms of climate change. It's a really dire situation, and it's impossible to imagine what our grandchildren are going to be living with. And it is the most critical, although there are many, many critical issues facing us as people and as societies, as human beings, this is the most critical one, and one feels very helpless to do anything about it. But it is absolutely number 1 issue. People who who know far more about it than I do, say there is still time for us to do something to halt it, but we all have to be pushing our governments to do it. We can, as individuals, do things, but there has to be a much bigger effort. So on that score, I feel, well, somebody asked David Attenborough why he didn't feel totally desperate, and he said, well, because I'm alive, and while you're alive you feel you can do something, you have to try and do something, and therefore you have to do something. And that's what I feel about that. About other things, about the way we run our societies, again, there's so much cause for pessimism. But there's a funny thing about the human spirit, is that anybody who's worked in situations of people who are dealing with great poverty or injustice or wars or whatever, you see examples of resilience everywhere. You see people being able to laugh. You see people making something out of nothing. It's awe-inspiring. And there is something, I mean, the human spirit can be crushed by too much adversity. There's no doubt about it. And people can be absolutely destroyed and become vicious and turn on each other. And that's a very common reaction. But there is also the other. And while there's the other, while there is love evident, while people are taking care of each other, while people are concerned for each other, we just go on smiling and building on it. And that's, I don't know whether you call that optimism, but it's basically, it's what we have to hold on to.
Thank you, Marion. And I think that resilience and that hope and that very personal sense of dealing with situations and what's thrown at you is such a running theme in all of the books that you've written. People, often women, but everybody dealing with different problems and adversity and coming through them, regardless of resources that they have or the atrocities that they've been through. So for everyone listening, I hope that gave you a really good taster of the book, but also the wider set of books that Marion has written, and Marion as a person and as quite an amazing writer and individual that she is. So I do hope that you enjoyed it. I'm going to pass over to Marion, who's just going to give you a taster of the rest of the series coming up, of the Creative Women series.
Thank you so much, Jen, and thank you everybody out there. The details of the rest of the series are on the NWR website, so please have a look. And each of the women that I'm interviewing in the coming series is somebody that, unlike Jen, somebody that I had never met before, that I only met because of going around doing the talks, and has completely enriched my life. And all of them they would probably all describe themselves as ordinary women, as we all are. We're all ordinary, but we're all creative. And so I think you'll find it fun listening to them. Natalie, over to you.
I just want to say thank you. That was absolutely brilliant. Very professionally done, might I say.
Well, thank you, Jen.
By both interviewer and interviewee. So thank you ever so much. That was really, really good.
Thank you.
And I'm sure that everyone on would say the same. And I, for one, am looking forward to the next one in the series. So we'll see you in a month's time. I'm sad that we're not going to see you again, Jen. We'll have to.
Thank you, Jen. That was really, really amazing. Thank you.
Marion, when you do your next book, we'll have to get Jen to interview you about the next one.
She has
see you in 6 years.
She has many talents, but I didn't realise quite how well developed this talent is.
Yes, very well developed, for sure.
Okay.
You've got various people saying thank you, but
bye everybody. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Bye.